Good evening, and welcome back. If this is your first night with us, I am glad you found your way here, and if you have been with me before, settle in. You already know how this works. Tonight, we are going up into the Andes, and we are going to take our time about it. So find whatever version of comfortable belongs to you. Let the lights go down if they have not already. Turn your phone face down, or better, let it rest somewhere across the room. There is nowhere you need to be for the next 2 hours except right here, drifting. Before I begin, I would love to know who is listening tonight. Leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are and what time it is where you are lying right now. I read everyone, even the ones left at strange hours. Now pull the blanket up and let's go looking for a city that was never supposed to survive as long as it has. High in the Andes, above the reach of most roads even now, there is a city built from stone that has outlasted almost everything built near it since. Colonial towns lower down the mountains, raised centuries later with mortar and iron reinforcement, have come apart in the shaking that the ground here produces without warning. This older city, set on a narrow ridge between two peaks, has not. Its walls have moved. You can see it if you know where to look. A slight give in a joint, a stone settled a hair's breadth from where it started. And then they have simply gone back into place, the way a boxer rolls with a blow instead of standing rigid against it. The city is called Machu Picchu, and it sits where the mountain drops away steeply on either side, a saddle of level ground pinned between two summits, with the forest and the river running so far below that on a clouded morning you cannot always see the bottom of the valley at all. You would have needed a reason to build somewhere like this. Nobody raises a city on a ridge like a knife's edge, with cloud forest crowding in on both sides and no easy way up unless something mattered enough to justify the climb. That reason had a name. The Inca Emperor Pachacuti, who expanded and remade the empire that would come to be called Tawantinsuyu, is understood by most who study this place to be the one whose ambition set the city in motion. A retreat, a estate, perhaps something closer to a sacred seat than a simple home, built for a ruler who could command labor and stone across an empire that stretched along the spine of a continent. We will come back to Pachacuti properly, and to what a man like him actually wanted from a place this difficult to reach. For now, it is enough to know that someone with that kind of reach looked at this particular ridge, impossible as it must have seemed, and decided that this was where he wanted to stand. And there was someone else standing there too, someone whose name did not survive the way Pachacuti's did, but whose hands did more of the actual work of making this city outlast its makers. Among the many skilled workers the empire could call upon, there were master stonemasons, men who had spent years learning how a piece of granite wants to break, how to read the grain of it the way a good carpenter reads timber, how to test a joint with nothing more than their own fingertips run along a seam. One of them, unnamed in any record that reached us, will keep appearing in this story because it was people like him, not emperors, who solved the actual problem of how you build something on a ridge like this that will still be standing long after you're gone. Let that sit with you for a moment if you like, or let it go. There is nothing here you need to hold on to yet. We have 2 hours and the details will come back around when they matter. Before this becomes the story of quarries and joints and the long climb of stone up a mountainside, I want you to stay a moment longer with the plain fact of the city surviving, because it really is the strangest thing about the place once you have spent any time around old buildings the way I have. I spent my working life around concrete and steel, around sites where a crack in a foundation could mean months of argument and repair. And I can tell you that most structures do not forgive movement. They are built to resist it, to fight the ground rather than answer it, and when the fighting fails, they fail with it. That is what happened again and again to the towns the Spanish built lower in these same mountains after this city had already stood empty for generations, towns raised with the techniques familiar across the old world, stone bound together with mortar, walls squared and mostly rigid, foundations that assumed the earth beneath them would hold still. The earth here does not hold still, it has never held still. And when it moved, those newer towns often did not have anywhere for the energy to go, so the walls simply broke. The ridge city took the same shaking and did something different with it. Something in the way the stones were shaped and set into their walls let each one shift very slightly against its neighbors and then return, the whole wall breathing rather than resisting, dispersing the force instead of standing against it until it cracked. You can hear that idea and nod along, the way you might nod at a diagram in a lecture, but standing there among the walls yourself is a different thing entirely. Had you climbed up to this ridge, breathing harder than you expected in the thin air, and put your palm flat against one of the larger walls near the temple structures, you would have felt stone so closely fitted against stone that you could not have worked a blade of grass into the seam, and yet none of it held together with anything you would recognize as mortar. No paste, no binding agent, nothing but the shape of the stones themselves, cut and set so precisely that friction and weight did all the holding. That is the puzzle this whole story circles around, and it is worth sitting with before we go further into who built it and why, because everything that follows, the choosing of this impossible ridge, the quarrying, the moving of stone without wheels or draft animals suited to the terrain, the terracing that kept the mountain itself from sliding out from under the city, all of it exists to answer one question. How do you build something on a mountain that shakes out of nothing but shaped stone and make it outlast empires? So let's ask the smaller question first, the one that actually gets us moving toward an answer. What does it take to build something that can shrug off the ground itself, moving beneath it, using no metal tools to speak of, no wheel, no draft animal built for this terrain? Nothing but human labor, patience, and an intimate knowledge of stone. Because that is really what we are talking about when we talk about the master masons of this empire, and it is worth spending some real time with them before we go further, because their fingerprints, so to speak, are on every wall we will walk past in the hours ahead. Picture the work itself for a moment, since it is easier to understand a craft by watching it than by hearing it described. A mason like the one I mentioned would have spent years, likely from boyhood, simply learning stone before he was trusted to shape it for a wall that mattered. He would have learned which faces of a granite block held tension and which held weakness, learned it the way a woodworker learns grain by breaking enough poor pieces to recognize a good one on sight. By the time he was given real work on a site like this ridge, his hands would have known things his mind might not have been able to put into words at all. A kind of knowledge that lived in calluses and habit rather than in anything written down, which is part of why so much of this craft has had to be reconstructed rather than simply read from a text. There was no manual. There were only masters and the men learning beside them, generation folding into generation, each one inheriting a slightly sharper sense of how a stone wanted to sit. You would have seen him, had you stood on that ridge while the work was underway, crouched low over a block that had already taken weeks to bring even this far, running the edge of a smaller stone along the face of it, testing, tapping, listening for a sound that told him where the granite was ready to give and where it was not. This was not fast work, and it was never meant to be. Every joint in these walls represents hours you and I would find almost unbearably patient. A single stone lifted and set and lifted again, ground very slightly at the point of contact, set once more, checked again until the fit was close enough that the mason trusted it with the weight of everything that would eventually sit above it. If you have ever tried to fit two pieces of wood together so perfectly that no one could see the seam, multiply that patience by the size of a paving stone, then imagine doing it while balanced on a mountain ridge, in air thin enough to make ordinary breathing an effort, and you begin to have some sense of what this craft actually demanded of the people who practiced it. It is worth letting yourself drift a little here, because this is the rhythm the whole city was built inside of. Slow, exact, unhurried by the standards of any builder you or I might have worked alongside. There was no deadline pressing down on that mason the way there is on almost every job I ever stood over in my own working life. There was only the stone, and the wall it was going to become, and the mountain underneath both of them, quietly making its case that anything built here would eventually have to answer to it. Before we follow that mason any further into his craft, though, we need to go back to the man who set this whole undertaking moving in the first place, because nothing about the ridge, the terraces, or the walls makes much sense until you understand what an emperor like Pachacuti actually wanted from a retreat built this far above the world he ruled, and why an empire already stretched the length of a continent would spend so much of its labor lifting stone toward the clouds. If you would like more nights like this one, more cities and ships and bridges told slowly enough to fall asleep inside, there is a subscribe button somewhere near your thumb, and it costs you nothing to press it before your eyes close. For now, let's go back down the mountain a little, into the empire that made a city like this possible at all. Before there was a city on that ridge, there was an empire that had already convinced itself the mountains were listening. That is not a metaphor I use lightly. If you had stood on one of its roads at dawn, the kind of road that ran along a ridgeline or clung to a cliff face with a wall of dry stone holding the outer edge, you would have felt how deliberately that empire had been laid over the land rather than simply built upon it. Every peak had a name. Every spring had a keeper. The people who ran that empire did not think of stone and water and weather as separate from the gods they prayed to. The mountain was the god, or close enough that the difference hardly mattered to the men and women who left offerings at its shoulders before they climbed past. You would have passed storehouses cut into hillsides, terraces stepping down toward rivers you couldn't yet see, and everywhere the sense that nothing here was accidental. An empire like that does not build a retreat in a valley because a valley is easy. It builds where the difficulty itself means something. That empire is the one we now call Inca, though the people who ran it called themselves something closer to the four parts bound together, a realm stitched from valley kingdoms and coastal cities and highland herding grounds into a single administered whole, governed from a capital in a bowl of mountains called Cusco. Cloth mattered more than gold there, oddly enough, in the accounting of the state. Though gold was never scorned, it was called the sweat of the sun, warm and untarnishing, fit only for the households of rulers and the walls of temples. And it was under one ruler in particular, a man remembered as Pachacuti, that this realm stopped being a regional power worth watching and became something that reordered the entire western spine of a continent within the space of a single long reign and the reigns that followed close behind it. If you are already half asleep, you do not need to hold on to any of that. What matters is only this. A very large, very organized, very devout state had, by the time it turned its attention to a saddle of rock above a river gorge, both the wealth and the workforce and the religious conviction to build almost anywhere it chose. So the question worth sitting with, the one that generations of people who study this place still turn over without quite agreeing, is why it chose that particular saddle of rock at all. There is no single answer written down anywhere, no foundation stone with an inscription explaining the decision, because the Inca kept no writing system in the way we would recognize one. What survives is stone and terrace and channel, and the oral accounts that Spanish chroniclers wrote down a full century after the fact, filtered through translators and memory and the politics of conquest, which means every theory about this city's purpose has to be held a little loosely. One line of thinking treats it as a royal estate, a private retreat built for Pachacuti himself and his household, a place where an emperor could hunt, entertain, and worship away from the crowded lanes of Cusco, staffed year-round by retainers whose whole working life was bound to keeping one man's mountain house running, whether he was there or not. Another reads it as something closer to a religious sanctuary, a place chosen because of what surrounded it, rather than what could be built on it. Ringed by peaks the Inca considered sacred in their own right, and positioned along sight lines to the sun that would have mattered enormously to a people whose calendar and whose agriculture and whose sense of order in the universe were all bound up in watching where the sun rose and set across the year. A third theory leans on the astronomy directly, pointing to the placement of certain windows and stones that seemed to catch the light of the solstice in ways too precise to be accidental, and arguing the whole site functioned partly as an observatory, a place where priests could read the sky the way an engineer today reads a gauge. None of these theories cancel each other out, and that is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. A royal retreat could also be a sanctuary. A sanctuary could also track the sun. The Inca did not appear to divide their world into tidy categories the way a modern planning department might, with one zone for worship and another for leisure and a third for research. A mountain that mattered religiously, and a house that mattered politically, and a window that mattered astronomically could all be the same stones, serving all three purposes on the same afternoon. What almost everyone who studies the site agrees on is that it was Pachacuti's project, commissioned in his name if not entirely finished in his lifetime, and that whatever else it was never accidental. You do not carry a nation's labor a mile into the sky by accident. But what kind of empire produces a ruler who would spend so much of that labor on a mountain saddle that no army needed to hold and no trade route needed to cross? That is worth slowing down for, because Pachacuti is not a name that should pass by quickly in this story. Before he took power, by most of the surviving accounts, Cusco was still just one kingdom among several jostling for room in the highlands, and a dangerous rival people called the Chanca had pushed close enough to the capital that its fall seemed likely rather than unthinkable. The chronicler Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, writing down what he was told by descendants of the ruling families 100 years later, describes a young prince stepping forward when his own father, the king, had already fled the city, rallying what defenders remained and turning back an army that everyone else assumed had already won. Whether every detail of that account survived a century of retelling intact is impossible to know, and worth saying plainly rather than pretending otherwise. But the pattern that follows is documented well enough across multiple sources to trust. Whoever this man was, he did not stop at saving Cusco. He rebuilt it. He reorganized the surrounding valley's irrigation and its terraces. He restructured how labor was owed to the state and how that labor was then spent on roads and storehouses and temples, turning what had been a regional court into the administrative spine of an empire that would eventually run the length of the continent's western edge. His name, Pachacuti, is usually translated as something like "he who remakes the world" or "he who overturns time and space," and by the account of nearly every source that mentions him, he seems to have taken that name seriously as a working instruction rather than a title to be worn lightly. A ruler like that does not commission a retreat the way a tired official commissions a weekend house. Everything Pachacuti is remembered for building carries the same signature: an enormous appetite for reshaping difficult ground into something ordered, terraced, watered, and permanent. Cusco itself, under his direction, was rebuilt with new channels bringing water down from the hills and new walls fitted with a precision that later visitors would struggle to credit to hand tools alone. If that was the pattern in the capital, where the ground was at least reasonably level and the labor could stay close to home, you can start to feel why a ridge above a river gorge, hours of hard climbing from the nearest valley floor, would not have frightened a man like this away. It may well have been the difficulty that drew him, rather than despite it. Because the site he or his engineers eventually settled on was not, by any reasonable measure, an easy one. Picture standing on a narrow saddle of rock, a kind of stone bridge of land slung between two peaks, one called Huayna Picchu rising sharply to the north, and the other, Machu Picchu itself, climbing more gradually to the south, with the ground on either side of that saddle falling away in cliffs steep enough that you would not want to look down too long from the edge. There is no wide plain here. There is no gentle slope where you could simply lay foundations and build outward the way a mason would on a flat field near a river. The ridge is narrow enough in places that you could stand at its center and feel the drop on both sides at once. Cloud forest thick with orchids and moss climbing the slopes below. The river you cannot quite hear from up here twisting through the gorge a very long way down. Whatever theory you favor for why this site was chosen, the ground itself asks a much more immediate question, one that has nothing to do with religion or astronomy or royal privacy, and everything to do with the plain, physical problem of building anything at all. How do you even begin? On a spine of rock this narrow, this steep, this far from any quarry a normal builder would reach for. That is where the story has to go next, down into the ground itself, before a single stone was ever set in place. Long before anyone could ask what the ground could bear, someone had to choose the ground itself. And that choice was never made carelessly. You have to picture the Inca surveyors not as men with instruments, because they carried none of the kind you might expect, but as men who had spent their whole lives reading a landscape the way a sailor reads weather. They worked with sightlines, not with theodolites. Certain peaks were held to be alive in a way the modern mind resists calling literal, and a sight was tested by whether it could see them, whether a line drawn from a doorway or a carved outcrop would run true toward a snow-capped summit or toward the sound of a river far below. This was surveying in its way, as exact in its own terms as anything done later with brass and glass, and if you had stood beside one of these men on a ridge at dawn, you would have watched him turn slowly on the spot, checking not a compass but a horizon, waiting for a particular shoulder of rock to align with a particular fold of mountain. The whole procedure as unhurried and as certain as anything you have ever watched a craftsman do with his hands. The ridge that was eventually chosen sits high above the gorge of the Urubamba on a saddle of rock strung between two peaks, with the ground falling away sharply on both flanks toward the river far beneath. It is narrow in a way that is hard to appreciate until you are actually walking it. Narrow enough that from certain points you could stand with a steep drop close on either side of you, the mountain itself doing most of the work a defensive wall might otherwise have had to do. The elevation alone would have told the surveyors something useful, high enough to sit above the worst of the valley's heat and its insects, low enough to still hold enough soil and shelter for terraces and orchards, a kind of narrow middle ground between the high cold punas above and the thick wet forest below. It is the sort of sight that looks from a distance like an act of faith. Up close it looks like an act of very careful measurement, dressed afterward in the language of faith. If you had been walking that ridge in the company of the man responsible for turning a chosen site into an actual city, you would have noticed how little of his attention went to the view. Call him, as the record more or less allows you to, the master stonemason, one of the small number of men in the empire trusted to look at raw rock and see a wall already living inside it. He was not choosing a subject to admire. He was reading outcrops, tapping at bedrock with a stone in his hand, listening for the difference between a boulder that would hold and a boulder that would eventually shift, noting where the granite broke the surface cleanly enough to serve as a foundation all on its own, and where it disappeared beneath loose, treacherous ground that would need to be dealt with before anything else could happen. You can imagine him crouching at the edge of a drop that would make most visitors keep well back, running a hand along a seam in the stone, working out in his head where the first course of a wall might begin and where the rock itself refused to be built upon at all. There is nothing you need to hold on to from this part of the story, no name, no date, only the simple, steadying image of a man walking a knife edge of rock with his eyes on the ground rather than on the mountains around him, because the mountains were never the difficulty, the ground was. It was Pachacuti, by most accounts, who wanted a retreat built at this height and in this kind of isolation, and it would have been men answering to him who carried out these surveys, walking ridge after ridge, before this one was chosen over all the others nearby. But wanting a city on a mountain and actually being able to put one there are two very different orders of problem, and the second of those fell not to the ruler but to men like the mason, walking the stone with their hands, rather than their ambitions. He would have known, as anyone raised in that landscape knew, that a ridge this narrow gave you almost no room for error. There was no broad plain here to spread a mistake out across. Every terrace, every retaining wall, every building would have to sit exactly where the rock allowed it to sit, which meant the walking and the tapping and the listening had to happen before a single design was drawn, if drawing is even the right word for how these builders planned. But choosing a ridge for its views and its sightlines and its defensible narrowness is one kind of decision, and it leaves out a much older, much quieter question, one that has nothing to do with sacred peaks or royal comfort at all. Did anyone walking that spine of rock know, in the way a body knows, rather than the way an instrument records, that the ground itself could not always be trusted to stay still? The answer, almost certainly, was yes, and it would not have come from any priest or surveyor consulting a chart, because no chart existed. It would have come from memory, the kind that gets passed down as caution rather than as fact. The Andes are among the most seismically restless mountains on Earth, thrown up by the slow, relentless collision of one tectonic plate diving beneath another, a process that never stops and rarely announces itself gently. The people who lived across this region did not need a name for plate tectonics to know its effects. They had felt the ground move. They had watched walls elsewhere crack and settle and sometimes fall, had heard the stories their parents told about the years the earth had shrugged hardest, had built and rebuilt in valleys where a tremor might arrive with no warning beyond a low sound in the rock and a sudden unsteadiness underfoot. If you had asked the mason directly whether the earth here could shake, he would not have needed a lecture on the mechanics of subduction to answer you. He would simply have known it the way you know your own street floods in heavy rain, not from theory but from having lived through it and lived through it again. This is not the kind of knowledge that gets written into a plan because it does not need to be. It becomes instead a kind of default caution carried into every decision that follows, whether or not anyone ever speaks it aloud. And it means that from the very moment this ridge was chosen, before a single wall existed, before the terraces were even sketched into the slope in anyone's imagination, the ground itself was already the central problem the builders faced, more central than the shaping of the stone, more central than the moving of it, more central even than the labor it would take to raise the city at all. A narrow ridge is one kind of difficulty. A narrow ridge that occasionally moves beneath your feet is another kind entirely, and it changes everything about how you are allowed to build on it. If your eyes have already started to close somewhere in this last stretch, that is exactly the right place for them to be, because none of this needs to be remembered in any detail. What matters is only the shape of the problem left standing at the end of the choosing, the same problem the ridge itself seemed to pose the moment it was picked out from all the others nearby. You have a spine of rock, narrow enough to demand precision in every placement, sitting inside a landscape that has never once promised to hold still. The sacred peaks had been consulted, the rivers had been read, the views had been judged and found worthy of an empire's retreat. None of that had yet answered the one question that could not be settled by sightlines or by faith, the question of what actually lay beneath the surface the builders meant to stand on, and whether that ground, for all its height and all its beauty, could actually be trusted to carry the weight of a city through however many centuries of trembling earth lay ahead of it. That is the ground the story has to walk onto next, quite literally, down past the outcrops the mason had already tapped and tested, into the harder, slower work of building a foundation that could survive what the mountains themselves could not promise to hold still. You would have felt it first in the way the mason moved differently once the sightlines were settled, less like a man admiring a view and more like someone testing ice before he trusted it with his weight. He began working outward from the ridge's spine toward its edges, checking where solid granite gave way to looser fill, where centuries of frost and rain had already loosened what looked, from a few paces back, like perfectly solid ground. Some of what he found troubled him. Pockets of soil sat where bedrock should have been, shallow and unreliable, exactly the sort of places where a heavy wall might settle unevenly after only a few rainy seasons. Those places would need more than careful placement. They would need to be dug into, understood and answered before anyone laid a single stone on top of them. You would have felt it in your knees before you understood it with your eyes. That faint unevenness underfoot as the master stonemason moved from the ridge's spine outward, testing the ground the way a physician might press along a patient's side, listening for what did not sound right. Some ground answered him solidly, a low, true note, granite close beneath a thin skin of soil. Other ground gave a softer answer, a give in the earth that meant loose fill, old slope wash, centuries of frost cracking the mountain apart grain by grain and letting gravity carry the pieces downhill until they settled here, in pockets that looked, from where you might be standing a few paces back, like perfectly ordinary earth. It was not. And on a ridge like this one, with nothing below you for a very long way down, ordinary earth was not something anyone could afford to trust. This is the part of the story that never survives in the photographs, and it is worth sitting with for a while before the walls begin to rise, because nothing that came after would have meant anything without it. You do not have to remember any of what follows in detail. Let it settle over you the way the builders let the mountain settle under their hands, slowly, by touch, by patience, one test at a time. The problem, plainly, was this. A mountain ridge in that part of the Andes is not one continuous piece of stone waiting politely under a few inches of soil. It is granite where the old bones of the range break through, and it is loose, unconsolidated fill everywhere the weather has had time to work on it. Frost gets into a crack in solid rock, freezes, expands, and over enough winters, the rock gives way to rubble. Rain then carries that rubble downhill, mixes it with soil and decayed vegetation, and leaves it lying in shallow drifts across the ridge, sometimes only a hand's depth over bedrock, sometimes deep enough to swallow a person to the waist. From above, both kinds of ground can look the same. Underfoot, they are entirely different animals, and a wall raised without knowing which was which would not fail immediately. It would fail slowly, unevenly, over 2 or 3 rainy seasons, tilting a few fingers' width at a time until whatever stood on it came apart at the seams. You would have watched, had you been standing there, the stonemason and the men working with him move with a kind of unhurried thoroughness that had nothing to do with slowness and everything to do with respect for what they were dealing with. Where the ridge answered solid, they cleared the topsoil away and built directly on the living rock, shaping the granite itself where they needed a level bed, cutting it back with hammerstones until it held a true, flat face. Where the ridge answered soft, hollow, uncertain, they did something more laborious. They dug. Not a shallow scrape to level the ground, but a genuine excavation down through the loose fill until they reached bedrock or until they reached a layer firm and dense enough to trust, sometimes a matter of a few feet, sometimes considerably more, depending on what the mountain happened to be hiding in that particular spot. Into those excavated pits went the part of the work that almost no visitor ever thinks to ask about. Crushed stone, packed in layers, tamped down course by course, not simply poured in and left. Each layer was compacted before the next was added, so what eventually filled that pit was not loose backfill pretending to be solid ground, but something closer to a manufactured foundation, a bed of graded rubble built up specifically to carry weight without shifting. If you have ever watched a road crew building up a base course before laying pavement, or a builder compacting hardcore beneath a slab, you have seen a distant cousin of what these men were doing on that ridge, without machines, without the language of soil mechanics, working entirely from an accumulated inherited sense of what ground would hold and what ground would betray you. They could not have told you why compacted crushed stone resists settling better than loose earth. They knew it anyway, the way a mason today still knows it by feel, long before he learns the equations that explain it. And there is something almost tender in imagining that labor, invisible from the very first day it was finished, because every pit that was dug and refilled with packed stone would vanish completely under the structures built above it. No one walking through the finished city, then or now, would ever see this work directly. You are standing on it right now, in a manner of speaking. Whenever you picture yourself on one of those terraces or inside one of those chambers, and you would never know, without being told, that beneath your feet lies a foundation someone chose to build twice as carefully as anything visible above it, precisely because they knew it would never be seen or praised. That kind of labor, done well for its own sake, is not so different from the work engineers still do today, pouring footings no one will ever look at. And it is one of the reasons this story has stayed with me long after other, flashier ones have faded. But solving the problem of what the walls stood on was only half of the battle being fought beneath that ridge. What good is a firm foundation, carefully built up out of packed stone and honest labor, if the mountain simply lets rain sit against it season after season, softening everything from beneath? What was going to keep water, in a region that receives a genuinely enormous amount of it, from undoing every bit of that careful work within a decade of the city standing complete? The answer to that question is another piece of the site that almost nobody notices, and it lies just beneath the surface of nearly everything you would eventually walk across if you climbed that ridge yourself. Because rain in that part of the Andes does not fall politely and drain away. It arrives in long, heavy seasons, the kind that can turn a dry gully into a small river within an hour, the kind that finds every low point in a slope and tests it again and again, year after year, for as long as the mountain stands. A city built on a knife-edge ridge between two peaks, with drops on either side steep enough to make your stomach tighten, just imagining the edge, could not survive that kind of rainfall by accident. It needed water managed on purpose, deliberately, before a single wall went up. So underneath the buildings, underneath the plazas, underneath the terraces that would eventually step down the mountainside like a staircase built for giants, ran a network of channels that no visitor centuries later would ever be able to see simply by looking. Cut stone drains, lined and angled with a precision that still surprises engineers who study them now, carried water away from foundations before it had the chance to pool and soften the ground beneath them. Beds of gravel sat beneath courtyards and pathways, porous enough to let water sink through and travel sideways rather than gathering in one place and pressing outward against a wall. The whole ridge, in effect, was engineered to drink and shed water at the same time, absorbing what fell on it while quietly guiding the excess downhill and away from anything load-bearing, long before it could ever threaten to undermine a foundation someone had already dug down to bedrock to secure. If your eyes are already closed, this is a good part of the story to simply let drift past you because none of it needs to be memorized to be appreciated. What matters is only the shape of the idea. Every foundation pit answered a question about what the ground could carry. Every drain and gravel bed answered a second question about what the sky would eventually throw down on top of it. Together, they formed a kind of conversation between builder and mountain that had to be settled entirely before anything you would recognize as a building could begin. You can imagine the master stonemason kneeling again at the edge of one of these finished foundations, pressing a hand flat against the packed stone the way he had pressed it against bare earth weeks before, checking for any give, any softness, any sign that the ground had not been fully answered. Beside him, the laborers who had done the digging, men and women drawn from communities across the empire to give their season of labor here, on this ridge, waited to hear whether the pit needed refilling again or whether it was, at last, ready to carry weight. Their names went unrecorded, as the names of most who dug foundations always have, in every century, on every continent. But the work itself remained, silent and solid, waiting for the next thing the mountain would have to give up before this city could rise at all. Because foundations, however carefully built, are only ever half of the story. Somewhere close by, in the flanks of the very ridge being tested and drained and packed down course by course, lay the other half, still locked inside the rock itself, waiting to be found, split and carried the short, brutal distance from mountainside to work site. The quarries themselves were not far at all, and that closeness was, in its own quiet way, one of the great strokes of fortune in the whole undertaking. Had the builders needed to bring their stone from some distant valley, dragging it over passes and along rivers for months at a time, the city might never have risen in the form it did, might never have risen at all. But the ridge had given up a foundation, and now, walking only a short way from where the terraces were beginning to take their first shallow steps into the slope, you would have found the mountain offering its own flesh for the taking. Grey granite, pale in places and darker where water had stained it, lay exposed in long outcrops where the soil had thinned and the rock beneath had pushed itself up into daylight, as though the peak had simply grown tired of hiding what it was made of. You did not need to imagine where this stone came from. It came from underfoot, from the same body that would carry the finished city on its back for the rest of its existence, which meant that wall and mountain were never really two different things to begin with. Standing at the edge of one of these outcrops, you would have felt the granite before you understood it, cool even at midday, faintly gritty against the palm, marked with thin veins where different minerals had cooled at different rates thousands of years before anyone stood there to notice. It is a stone that does not forgive haste, and it does not reward force applied carelessly, and yet it was exactly this stubbornness that made it worth choosing over anything softer the mountain might have offered instead. But why choose the hardest material available, when there were softer stones nearby that would have split more easily and cost less sweat to shape? The answer sits in the same ground that had already proven so troublesome to build upon. A ridge this high, folded between two rivers, sitting above faults that shifted the earth every so often without warning, was never going to be a forgiving place to build. Soft stone crumbles under repeated shock. It fractures along weaknesses that a mason cannot always see in advance, and it wears quickly under rain and frost and the slow, chemical patience of lichen. Granite does none of these things easily. It is heavy enough to sit low and stable once placed, resistant enough to shrug off centuries of rain without dissolving at the edges, and dense enough that a wall built from it settles as a single mass rather than a stack of separate pieces waiting for an excuse to come apart. If the mountain was going to shake this city from time to time, and it would, then the stone chosen to build it needed to be the kind that could absorb a jolt and pass it along its own body, rather than splitting apart at the first hard tremor. There is nothing you need to hold on to here beyond that one idea: heavy, patient stone, chosen because the ground itself could not be trusted to stay still. Getting that stone out of the mountain, though, was its own long argument, fought without the tools that later ages would take for granted. No blasting powder existed here. No steel chisels rang against the rock. What the quarrymen had instead were wooden wedges, hammerstones of a stone even harder than the granite they meant to break, and a patient understanding of how rock actually wants to fail. The wedges were the quieter half of the method, and in some ways the more remarkable one. A crew would search the face of an outcrop for a natural fracture line, one of those faint veins or seams where the granite had already begun, in its own geological time, to think about splitting apart. Along that line they cut a row of narrow slots, working them with hammerstones struck again and again in the same spot until a shallow channel opened in the rock. Into each slot went a length of dry wood, cut to fit closely. And then came water, poured in steadily, left to sit, poured in again. Wood swells as it drinks, and it does so with a strength that surprises people who have never watched it happen. Given enough time, and granite is patient enough to allow that time, the swelling wood pressed outward against the sides of the slots until the stress found the natural weakness in the rock, and the block let go along the line the quarryman had chosen for it, rather than cracking wherever it pleased. You would have heard very little in the moment it happened. No explosion, no violent report, just a long, low groan of stone settling into a new shape, followed by a silence that told the crew their work had gone the way they wanted. Where the fracture lines were less obliging, or where a block needed rough shaping before it could be trusted to the wedges at all, the hammerstones did the heavier work directly. These were not the same soft rock being quarried, but something denser still, chosen precisely because it could strike granite without shattering itself on the first blow. A worker would raise one in both hands and bring it down again and again on the same point, not with great force behind any single strike, but with the patient repetition that wears a groove into stone over the course of an afternoon, a week, sometimes longer for the more stubborn faces. Bronze tools existed too, though bronze is a soft metal against granite, and did more of its work in the finer stages of shaping than in the brute business of splitting a block free from the mountain. The quarrying itself, the raw separation of stone from stone, belonged mostly to water, wood, and the blunt patience of a harder rock striking a slightly less hard one, over and over, until the mountain agreed to let a piece of itself go. None of it was fast. If you had stood at the quarry face for a full day, you might have watched only a single block loosen from its bed, and even then only if the fracture line had been kind. But speed was never really what this work asked for. It asked for judgment about where a stone wanted to break, and it asked for someone whose eye and whose hands had spent years learning to read that want before the wedges ever went into the rock. Which brings the story back to the master stonemason, the same figure who had walked the ridge earlier, choosing a foundation among ground that seemed to offer none. Here at the quarry face he appeared again, older perhaps in the record's telling, but recognizable in the same slow, deliberate way of moving across stone. He did not choose blocks the way a buyer chooses goods from a stall. He knelt beside an outcrop and pressed his palm flat against it, feeling for temperature differences too small for most hands to notice, differences that hinted at hidden moisture or a fracture already beginning beneath the surface. He tapped the rock with a small hammerstone and listened to the pitch of the sound it returned. A dull, absorbed note meaning something different from a bright, ringing one. A stone that rang cleanly, held together as a single piece. A stone that answered dully might already be split somewhere inside, invisible from without, waiting to fail at the worst possible moment once it had been set high in a wall. But how do you know? Standing beside a mountain face with no steel and no machines and no way to see inside solid rock, which block will hold and which will betray you 50 years after you are gone? You do not know it with certainty. You know it the way this man seemed to know it, through years spent with his hands against stone in every season, learning its grain the way another person might learn the moods of a river, until judgment became something closer to instinct than to calculation. If your eyes have already grown heavy, let this part settle over you gently. A man kneeling in the grey light of a mountain quarry, ear near the rock, testing not with instruments, but with attention, deciding which pieces of the mountain deserved to become part of the city and which did not. Once a block had passed his judgment, it still had to be roughed into something closer to a usable shape before it could be moved at all, since a jagged, uneven mass would only fight the ropes and rollers that lay ahead of it. That shaping was done here at the quarry, with the same hammerstones used to free it, workers striking away the least necessary corners, while the block still sat close to its bed of origin. And once it had been reduced to something more like a shape than a wound in the mountainside, the real difficulty of this entire enterprise still lay ahead. Not the splitting of stone from stone, which for all its patience was at least a problem the mountain helped to solve, but the far stranger question of how a piece of rock this heavy, in a land with no wheel and no draft animal built for hauling, was ever expected to travel the distance between the quarry face and the wall waiting to receive it. The block that had left the quarry as a rough, man-sized mass of granite did not arrive at the wall as a finished thing. It arrived, more truthfully, as a proposal, an educated guess by the men who had shaped it, offered up to the wall to see whether the wall would accept it. And this is where the story of Inca stonework becomes something closer to the story of a fitting than the story of a construction, because what happened next at the wall face was not building in the sense you might expect. It was conversation, conducted in stone, repeated as many times as the stone demanded. You would have seen this most clearly at the finest walls, the ones built for temples and for royal enclosures, where the masons worked in what is now called polygonal masonry. Stones with many faces, no two alike, each one shaped not to a standard but to its particular neighbor. Lower down the terraces, where the retaining walls held back earth rather than framing a doorway a king might use, the coursing runs straighter, closer to what is called ashlar, rows of rectangular blocks laid in level bands. Both were the same discipline underneath. The difference was only how much irregularity the builders were willing to let a stone keep, and irregularity in this practice was never a flaw to be hidden. It was a problem to be solved stone by stone. Picture the wall as it stood, half-grown, its upper edge uneven, waiting. A block would be raised into position, by rope, by ramp, by the ordinary sweat of many hands working together, the actual hauling itself a story already told and not one to repeat here, and set down close to where it was meant to rest. Then it would be lifted away again almost immediately. Whatever had touched the stone below it, wherever the two surfaces had made contact, left a mark, a faint bruise of dust or a smoothed patch that told the mason exactly where the fit had failed. That was the entire method. Touch, lift, read the mark, grind away what the mark condemned, and try again. You do not need to know a single technical term to understand what this actually asks of a person. It asks for the willingness to fail quietly over and over, without losing patience with the stone. The grinding itself was slow in a way that is hard to picture from a warm bed at this hour, and there is nothing you need to hold on to about the details of it. only the shape of the labor, which was to rub stone against stone, using sand and water and smaller handheld abrasive stones, wearing down high points by the width of a fingernail at a time. A single joint might be lifted and reset a dozen times before it closed. Some, by the account of masons who have studied these walls since, appear to have been set and reset far more than that. And you can imagine, if you let yourself, what it would have felt like to be the one doing this work in the thin air of that ridge, the cold at your back in the mountain shade, the sun sharp wherever it reached you, the same motion of the wrist repeated until the stone answered back the way it was supposed to. The man most responsible for judging when a joint was good enough was not the strongest worker on the site, and he was not necessarily the highest in rank among the laborers gathered there. He was the one whose hands had learned, over years spent doing exactly this, what a closed seam felt like under the fingers before the eye had even confirmed it. Call him the master stonemason, because no name for any single one of them survives, and because he stands here for a great many men like him, men whose skill was the kind that a culture without written technical manuals had to pass on entirely through the body, teacher to apprentice, hand guiding hand. You met men like him already at the quarry face, choosing which vein of granite would split clean and which would shatter. Here, higher up, at the wall itself, it was very often the same kind of man, sometimes literally the same figure, following the stone from the cliff where it was borne to the place where it would spend the rest of its existence standing still. His daily routine had almost nothing dramatic in it, and that plainness is worth sitting with for a moment before sleep takes you, because so much of the finest work ever done in the world has looked exactly this ordinary from the outside. He walked the finished sections of wall each morning with his palm open, running it along the seams the way you might run a hand along a banister without quite thinking about it, feeling for the places where a fingertip could still slip between two stones. Where it slipped, the joint was not finished, whatever it looked like to the eye. Where his palm passed smooth and unbroken across a seam he could no longer feel, the joint was allowed to stand, and the next stone above it could be lifted into place. There was no mortar anywhere in this wall to forgive a poor fit. No paste of lime or clay was going to fill the gap and hold the weight regardless. The stones themselves had to hold the wall up entirely by the honesty of their contact with one another, and that meant the master's hand, more than any tool on the site, was the true instrument of quality on this ridge. But why go to such trouble at all? Why spend so many days on a single seam, when a simpler wall of mortared rubble would have stood just as well in a calmer country, and stood faster, and cost far less in patience and in sweat? The answer was not sitting in front of these builders as a written rule, and it was almost certainly not something any single mason could have explained to you in words the way an engineer today might explain it on a drawing. But the ground under this ridge moved. It had moved before the first stone was ever quarried, and everyone who had lived their whole life in that part of the world understood, the way you understand weather, that it would move again. A wall built with mortar behaves like a single rigid sheet. When the ground beneath it lurches, the sheet has no way to absorb the motion except by cracking, and once it cracks, the crack does not heal itself when the shaking stops. It only waits for the next tremor to widen it further. A dry-fitted wall of interlocking many-sided stones behaves altogether differently, and this difference is the quiet genius sitting inside every joint that stonemason ever tested with his palm. Because the blocks were never bonded to one another, only held by the precision of their shared surfaces and the honest weight of gravity pressing down through the whole structure, the wall had somewhere for the earthquake's energy to go. Individual stones could shift, rock very slightly against their neighbors, and then, because their faces had been ground to fit so closely in the first place, settle back into almost exactly the position they had left. Engineers who have studied these walls in more recent generations sometimes describe the effect as something close to a controlled dance, the stones nudging and returning rather than breaking, and you do not have to remember the technical language of that comparison to feel the sense of it. A rigid thing shatters under a shock it cannot bend to. A thing built from many small, well-fitted parts can move a little and still remain whole. It is worth resting here, in the dark, on the strangeness of that idea. that the very slowness which must have tested every mason's patience, the endless lifting and grinding and resetting of a single stone, was at the same time the thing quietly buying the wall its future. No one needed to write down a theory of seismic isolation for this logic to be present in the work. It was present in the discipline itself, inherited hand to hand, tested against the ridge's own long memory of trembling ground, refined by generations of masons who had perhaps buried predecessors under walls that failed and had learned, slowly, what kind of wall did not. And this was not a technique reserved only for the grandest temple, the finest polygonal facade facing the plaza where a king might one day stand. The same patient logic, the same hand run along the same kind of seam, was waiting to be carried out across every terrace and stairway and modest dwelling wall this city would eventually contain, because a ridge that shakes does not spare its palaces and leave its ordinary walls untouched, and the builders of this place, whoever gave the order and whoever simply passed the knowledge on, seemed to have understood that survival could not be a privilege granted only to the most important stones. A retaining wall along the lower terraces might never face a king's eye, might spend its whole existence holding back nothing more glamorous than potato beds and rain, and still the same palm would walk its seams at dawn. Still the same grinding patience would be spent on stone no visitor would ever pause to admire. That quiet evenness of care is its own kind of clue, waiting to be followed further up the ridge, toward the places where the stones stopped being merely structural and started becoming something closer to a message. You would think, standing at the base of one of these walls in the dark hush before sunrise, that the stone above your head had always been there, grown out of the ridge like something the mountain simply decided to become. It had not. Every block along that wall had to travel, sometimes only a short distance from a quarry face a few hundred paces off, sometimes much farther, down from higher outcrops where the granite ran cleaner, and it had to travel without a single wheel turning beneath it, without an ox or a mule leaning into a harness, because the terrain here made both of those things nearly useless. A cart needs a road, and a road needs width, and width was the one thing this ridge never offered. What you had instead was footpath, switchback, and drop, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, stones the weight of a loaded wagon that still had to be walked, quite literally, into place. Picture the block itself first, because it helps to hold it in your mind the way the builders must have held it in theirs. Not a neat cube, not yet. A rough-hewn mass fresh from the quarry, its surfaces still faceted from the last strikes of the stone hammers, its true weight impossible to guess just by looking. You could stand beside one and feel small in a way that has nothing to do with fear, only scale. And this thing needed to move, over broken ground, along a spine of rock with a mountainside falling away on either hand, without cracking, without slipping, without crushing a single hand that guided it. The tools for this, when you list them out, sound almost too plain for the job. Timber logs, cut and trimmed to a rolling roundness, laid one after another beneath the stone like a temporary road that unmade itself as the block passed over it. Thick ropes, twisted from plant fiber, looped and knotted around the mass at points a mason had chosen with real care, because a rope tied wrong could shift the whole load sideways into a ravine. Earthen ramps built up and packed down along the route, gentle enough in their grade that many hands pulling together could gain ground without the stone gathering a momentum no one could arrest. That was the whole of it. No pulley towers, no iron chain, no beast of burden bred for pulling weight. Just wood, fiber, packed earth and people, a great many people, moving in time with one another like a single patient organism. You can imagine the sound of it before you can imagine the sight, a low chant, rhythmic, pitched to keep dozens of pairs of hands hauling in the same instant, because a rope pulled out of time with its neighbors does worse than nothing. It introduces a twist, a wobble, the very thing every foreman on that hillside was trying to prevent. Somewhere near the front of the line, a man with a practiced eye watched the logs as they rolled clear at the rear and were carried forward to be laid down again ahead of the stone, over and over, a road built one length at a time and consumed almost as fast as it was made. If you stood close enough, you might have felt the ground itself answer each pull. Not a shudder exactly, more a settling, the kind of low vibration that travels up through your feet before your ears have caught the sound that made it. The path itself dictated everything. Where the ridge narrowed, the whole operation narrowed with it. Ropes drawn in tighter, the margin between the stone's flank and open air reduced to something you would not have wanted to measure too closely. On a straightaway, more hands could take up the ropes and the work went relatively quickly. On a bend, the block had to be turned without ever losing its footing on the rollers, a maneuver that meant slowing the pull on one side while the other kept its rhythm so that the whole mass pivoted rather than slid. Get that wrong even slightly, and the block could walk itself straight off the edge of the path, taking with it the morning's labor and very possibly a life. There is no cheerful way to say that, and no honest way to leave it out either. This was dangerous, unglamorous, exacting work, done in silence, broken mostly by the chant and the creak of rope fiber taking a strain. And yet the wonder of it is not that accidents never happened. The record is not so tidy as to claim that, but that the system worked at all, reliably enough again and again, to raise a city out of a ridge that offered no easy path to any part of it. Let that settle a moment if your thoughts have already begun to drift with the rhythm of that old chant. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, only the shape of a problem and the shape of the answer the mountain's own people found for it. But rollers and ropes and packed ramps only explain how a stone moved once enough hands had gathered around it in the right places, pulling the right lines at the right count. And that raises the question that sits underneath the whole enterprise, quieter than the chant but just as important. Who could summon that many hands, tuned to that rhythm again and again, block after block, for as long as a project like this one required? It helps to remember that none of this ramp and roller machinery was meant to last. That is easy to forget, looking at what remains today, because what remains today is only ever the stone itself, patient and finished, giving no hint of the scaffolding of earth and timber that once surrounded it. But the ramps, built to raise a wall higher than a person's reach, were temporary by design. Packed earth meant to be dug away once the last course had settled into place, and the counterweights, heavy loads rigged on ropes over improvised supports, used here and there to help ease a block down a slope or swing it gently around a difficult corner, were dismantled the moment their purpose was served. Nothing about them was meant to be admired. They were meant to disappear, leaving only the wall, so that anyone arriving afterward would see a piece of architecture standing in apparent stillness, with no memory at all of the labor and improvised machinery that had briefly surrounded it like scaffolding around a tree. There is a kind of foresight in that willingness to build something only to take it apart again. An engineer today spends a great deal of time thinking about temporary works. The shoring that holds an excavation open, the false work that carries a bridge deck until its own arch can carry itself, the props that hold a wall while its mortar cures. All of it costed, planned, and then removed, its only trace a faint memory in the site diary. Whoever oversaw the ramps on this ridge was solving exactly that kind of problem centuries before the word engineer existed in any language spoken here, and solving it with almost nothing but earth, rope, and timber replenished from the forest each time a length of scaffolding needed to grow. If you have ever watched a construction site where the false work comes down and reveals for the first time a structure standing free on its own strength, you have felt a small version of what those builders must have felt, watching a temporary earthen ramp dug away to leave nothing behind but a wall that would outlast them by longer than they could have reasonably imagined. None of it, though, explains itself without people. A ramp does not build itself, a rope does not tie itself around a stone, and a chant does not keep its own rhythm. Every stage of what you have just walked through in your mind depended on a labor force large enough, disciplined enough, and willing enough to be organized into these long, dangerous, coordinated pulls over and over, season after season, until an entire city's worth of stone had been walked into place along this ridge. That labor did not appear by accident, and it was not hired in any sense you would recognize from a modern building site. It was drawn from an empire's own particular understanding of what its people owed to the state that governed them, And it is to that system, how such enormous numbers of hands were gathered, fed, rotated, and set to work in rhythm, that the story turns next, before returning to the terraces still waiting their turn along the slope below. Consider for a moment the quarry face itself, well before any rope was tied. A mason would walk the outcrop slowly, reading fractures in the granite the way you might read grain in a piece of timber, looking for the seams the mountain had already half decided to give up. Wooden wedges, soaked and swollen with water, were driven into these natural lines, patient rather than forceful, coaxing a block free rather than blasting it loose. Days could pass this way, waiting on wood to swell against stone, before a single face ever moved. You do not need to hold the details, only the sense of a people willing to let the mountain set the pace, rather than forcing their own. That patience, though, still needed hands enough to carry it forward once the stone came free, and gathering those hands was its own kind of engineering. You are not imagining a single crew that stayed for years and watched the walls rise beneath their own hands. You are imagining something closer to a tide, men arriving in waves, working their allotted turn, and going home again, replaced by others from another valley entirely, so that the mountain never lacked for hands, even though almost no one who came ever saw the whole of what they were building. That, more than any wedge or lever, was the quiet machinery holding the project together. The Inca called it mita, and it was less a labor gang than a kind of tax, paid not in maize or cloth but in time and sweat, owed by every household in the empire to the state that fed and clothed and organized them. If you had been born a farmer in one of the valleys under Inca rule, you would have known the obligation before you were old enough to carry a full load. Villages were counted and grouped in units of tens and hundreds and thousands, a decimal bookkeeping of people that let officials know, almost to the man, how many bodies a province owed the crown in any given season. Local lords, answerable to imperial administrators, drew up the rosters and sent them forward, and a man's turn might come once every year or once every few years for a stretch of weeks or months, depending on what the empire needed done that season. A road cut through a pass, a granary raised on a hillside, or here, a ridge of granite that needed shaping into a retreat fit for an emperor. There was no coinage changing hands in any of this, and you would search the ruins in vain for anything resembling a paymaster's ledger of wages. The empire ran on obligation and reciprocity instead, a debt owed by the people and repaid, in theory at least, by the feasts, the tools, the food, and the protection the state provided in return. The record keepers who tracked all this carried no paper. They carried knotted cords called quipu, and somewhere among the officials attached to this worksite there would have been a man whose entire duty was reading and retying those knots, recording whose turn had come, whose turn had passed, how many days a crew had labored, how much maize and dried meat had been issued against that labor. You will not find his name in any surviving account because no chronicler thought to ask for it, but you can picture him easily enough, crouched near the supply stores with his cords across his knees, translating the arithmetic of an empire into loops of colored wool, while around him men who had walked for days to reach this ridge waited to be told which terrace or which wall would take their strength next. Coca leaf traveled with them from lower altitudes, carried up in bundles the way you might carry salt or dried fish, and it was chewed constantly at this elevation, tucked into the cheek with a pinch of ash to draw out its effect. It dulled hunger a little, eased the thin air a little, and by every account that survives it was issued freely to workers on state projects precisely because the labor demanded it. No one climbing scaffolding at this height, hauling stone that had already exhausted whole days of a life just getting free of the quarry, could have kept the pace on empty lungs and an empty stomach alone. You do not need to hold on to the details of how it was prepared or exactly who received what share. It is enough to know that the mountain took something from every man who worked it, and the coca leaf was one of the ways the empire gave a little of it back. And there was singing. Later chroniclers, writing decades after the empire had fallen, recorded that heavy communal labor in the Andes was carried out to work chants, rhythmic calls that synchronized the pull of a rope or the heave of a lever, the same instinct that put a shanty in the mouths of sailors raising an anchor half a world away. Picture the sound of it. A line of men bent to a cable of woven fiber thick as a forearm, a single voice calling out a phrase and the rest answering it in unison, the pull timed to the fall of the last syllable. You would have heard it drifting up through the pass before you ever saw the men making it, carried strangely by the thin mountain air, the words indistinct but the rhythm unmistakable. Work turned into something closer to music because music was what kept the strain of it bearable. But what did the days themselves actually feel like up here for a man 3 weeks into a turn of labor he had not chosen and could not shorten? They would have felt shaped above everything else by the altitude and by the season, because both dictated what was possible before either dictated what was wise. You wake in this imagining before the sun has cleared the eastern ridge, in a shelter that is little more than fieldstone walls and a thatch of ichu grass, sharing warmth with men from your own village, because that was how the Mitta crews were kept together, not scattered at random, but grouped by home community, so that at least the language around the fire and the customs of the meal were familiar even when nothing else was. The cold at this height bites hardest in the last hour before dawn, and you would have felt it through whatever cloth you owned before you felt anything else that day. Breakfast was maize usually, sometimes freeze-dried potato reconstituted into a thin stew, the kind of food that traveled well and kept for a rotating population that never stayed in one place long enough to farm for itself. The state's storehouses supplied it, drawn from grain grown in the terraces of 100 other valleys and carried up by llama train along paths cut for exactly this purpose. You eat quickly because the work does not wait for you to linger, and then you climb toward whichever face of the mountain your crew has been assigned that week, the quarry, the terrace wall, the channel being cut for water that has not yet been allowed to run. The rhythm of the seasons mattered as much as the rhythm of the days. The rains came hard enough for months at a stretch to turn bare earth to a hazard and make the handling of heavy stone on a slope something close to reckless, so the calendar of construction bent around the weather the way a farmer's calendar bends around a harvest. Certain work, the rough quarrying, the felling and fitting of the largest blocks, belonged to the drier months. Other work, less dependent on footing and haulage, could continue through the wet. You do not need to memorize which task belonged to which season. It is enough to feel the shape of a worksite that never fought the sky, only waited on it, the same patience you have already seen the builders show toward the stone itself. Somewhere among these rotating crews, never resting for long in any one place, stood the man who did not rotate at all, the master mason whose hands you have already watched study the grain of a granite face, deciding where a joint should fall and where a stone must be turned before it would ever sit right against its neighbor. He was not a laborer in the way the Mitta crews were laborers. His skill was the one thing the empire could not draw from a village roster in equal measure from every household. And so men like him stayed through turn after turn of workers, teaching a fresh crew of farmers, in a matter of weeks, enough of the mason's eye to place a stone correctly under his direction, even if none of them would ever again in their lives be asked to do it. You can imagine him walking the length of a half-built wall in the evening light, running a palm across a seam that would outlast every person then standing on that ridge, saying little, because there was little that needed saying to men who would be gone within the month and replaced by others just as willing. If your eyes have already begun to close somewhere in the last few minutes, there is nothing here you need to hold on to, only the sense of an empire moving its own people up a mountain in patient, unhurried waves, one turn of labor at a time. And so the walls did not rise the way a modern eye expects a building to rise, in a single continuous push from foundation to roofline. They rose the way a coastline is shaped by tide after tide, one rotation of Mitta laborers finishing a stretch of terrace that another rotation would extend the following dry season. The master mason, the only constant thread running through years of arrivals and departures. A visitor returning after 2 full turns of the seasons would have found the ridge changed almost beyond recognition, a wall grown taller, a terrace grown wider, and yet no single day inside that span would have looked to the people living it like anything more than another ordinary shift of labor and rest. It took years, not months, measured less in a builder's calendar than in the slow accumulation of ordinary turns, each one small, each one unremarkable, until the mountainside itself began to answer back in stone. And it was that same patient reshaping of the slope that would soon have to solve a harder problem still. Not how to raise a wall, but how to keep an entire mountainside from sliding away beneath it. You would have felt it before you understood it if you had stood where the builders stood, on a slope so steep that a dropped tool would keep rolling until the jungle swallowed it. Below the citadel walls, the mountainside had always fallen away in the same restless way that steep ground falls away everywhere in the world. Soil sliding under its own wet weight, water cutting new paths every rainy season, roots finding no purchase in earth that would not sit still. A city could not be built above a slope like that and expect to survive its first heavy rain, let alone its first earthquake. So before the walls rose, and in truth for as long as the walls kept rising, another kind of construction was climbing the mountain alongside them, quieter, lower to the ground, and in its own way just as demanding of the hands that built it. The terraces are the part of this place that people walk past too quickly, eyes already lifted toward the temples above. But if you let your gaze drop for a moment, down past the postcard view, you find row after row of retaining walls curving along the contours of the slope like the rings of a tree, each one holding a shelf of flat ground where none had existed before. They look from a distance almost decorative, a soft green stepping of the hillside. Up close with your palm against the stone, you feel how little decoration had to do with it. Each wall leans back into the hill at a slight, deliberate angle, battered rather than vertical, so that the weight of everything behind it presses down and inward rather than out and away. That lean is not guesswork. It is the same instinct any engineer learns to trust, that a wall asked to hold back moving ground survives longest when it refuses to stand up straight and proud against the load and instead agrees, just slightly, to lean into it. What those walls were built to hold back was not simply soil. It was a whole engineered cross-section, built up in layers the way you might build a filter, because in a sense that is exactly what it was. At the base of each terrace sat broken stone and rubble, the coarse leftover fragments from the quarrying that shaped the finer blocks above the city. Nothing wasted, everything given a second use. Above that rubble came a layer of gravel, smaller stone packed loosely enough to let water pass freely through it. Above the gravel, a bed of sand. And only on top of all of that, as the final skin, the dark, fertile topsoil that could actually hold a crop. You do not need to remember the order of it to feel what it means. Rain falling on a terrace at Machu Picchu does not sit on the surface and turn it to mud. It sinks, layer by layer, coarsening as it goes, until it reaches channels built into the terrace walls themselves and is carried away, quietly, into the mountain's own drainage rather than being left to gather and slide. If you had walked this slope during the wet months, you would have heard that drainage working before you ever saw it. A faint, steady trickle somewhere beneath your feet. Water moving through stone the builders had shaped for exactly that purpose. The kamayok, the local term for the specialist overseers who answered for a particular craft, would have walked these rows checking not the crops but the water, because they understood, the way any good engineer understands, that a structure fails first at the place where water is allowed to linger. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no name or number worth keeping awake for, only the feel of it. Water finding its way down through stone that was built, layer by patient layer, to let it pass. The terraces solved the immediate practical problem first, the one that had nothing to do with grandeur at all. How do you grow enough food to feed a settlement clinging to a ridge with almost no naturally flat ground anywhere near it? Every terrace was farmland won back from a slope that offered none for free. But solving that problem meant solving erosion at the same time, because a terrace that could not hold its own soil through a season of rain was not a terrace at all, only a temporary shelf waiting to collapse. And once you have solved erosion at this scale, once you have built hundreds of retaining walls locking a mountainside into place tier by tier, you have quietly built something far larger than a farm. You have built a skeleton around the hill itself. But a terrace that holds soil in place during a rainstorm is one kind of achievement. Could the same rows of stone actually help hold up the mountain against something as sudden and violent as an earthquake, a force that does not soak in slowly over days but arrives, if it arrives at all, in a matter of seconds? The answer sits in the same drainage that keeps the crops alive. Earthquakes rarely bring down a slope by shaking it loose on their own. More often, it is saturated ground, soil heavy with trapped water, that turns to something closer to liquid under a sudden jolt and lets go all at once. The terraces, by pulling water down and out through their layered fill before it ever has the chance to saturate the slope, remove much of the fuel that a landslide needs. A ridge that drains well is a ridge far less likely to fail when the ground begins to move, whatever the cause. It is the same principle you would find in a modern engineer's report on slope stability, written in careful modern language about pore pressure and shear strength, sitting quietly inside stonework laid centuries before anyone had those words for it. There is a second effect, harder to measure but no less real, in the sheer mass and geometry of the terracing itself. Dozens of low walls, each one battered back into the hill, each one tied to the ridge along its full length rather than standing as a single tall barrier, act less like a wall and more like a series of flexible braces wrapped around the mountain's shoulders. A tall, rigid structure resists an earthquake by trying to stay perfectly still and pays for that rigidity when it finally cracks. A landscape of short, staggered, slightly yielding terraces has room to shift a little, terrace by terrace, without the whole slope giving way in one motion. If your eyes have already started to close, let this part settle in slowly rather than sharply. The mountain was not so much defended as it was gently reorganized, given a structure that could absorb movement instead of only opposing it. None of this would have looked to Pachacuti like a purely defensive measure. The ambition that had chosen this ridge in the first place was never only about safety. A slope combed into hundreds of neat green tiers, visible from every approach, was also a statement, proof that the empire's reach extended even into ground the mountain itself seemed to have refused. Terracing fed the retreat, yes, but it also announced something about the order the Inca believed they could impose on wild, uncooperative land, the same appetite for mastery that had chosen an impossible ridge to begin with. You are standing, in a sense, inside two ambitions at once. The practical one, which wanted dry soil and stable ground, and the imperial one, which wanted the whole mountain to look from a distance like something bent quietly to human will. And it is on top of that, engineered, drained, gently yielding shoulder of the mountain that the city's stone core was finally allowed to rise. The temples and plazas and staircases you have already begun to picture climbing above the terraces, resting on ground that had been made, patiently and invisibly, safe enough to carry them. Getting even that shoulder ready for stonework was its own long labor, one that rarely appears in the guidebooks written about the temples above it. Somebody had to carry every rock of that rubble base up a slope where a laden llama could barely keep its footing, let alone a man with a woven sack of broken stone across his back. The Kamayok who walked the finished rows checking the drainage were only the last stage of a chain of hands that had begun much earlier, lower down, where the gravel and sand were sorted and carried up in loads small enough for a single back to bear, trip after trip, season after season. No record kept their names. They are simply there, in the evenness of the fill beneath your feet, in the patience of ground that took years rather than weeks to prepare. But how do you decide where a terrace wall should stop and the next one should begin on a slope that never repeats itself twice? That question would have belonged to the same builders who later cut and set the fine Ashok blocks of the temples, because the skill was continuous rather than divided. A mason who understood how a joint should sit against another stone also understood how a wall should sit against a hillside, reading the ground the way you might read a face, for the places it wanted to give and the places it would hold firm without asking. If your attention has already begun to drift, that is no loss here. The shape of this argument matters more than any single stone in it. What that reading produced, terrace by terrace, was a foundation broad enough and forgiving enough to carry something far heavier than crops, and it is to that heavier weight, the granite walls finally allowed to rise above the tiers, that the story now climbs. By the time the terraces had settled into their long, patient rows, the ridge no longer looked like a mountain that men had merely stepped into. It looked like a place that had always meant to hold a city, and was only now remembering the shape of it. If you stood where the builders stood, on the saddle between the two peaks, you would have seen the ground begin to organize itself, the way a drawing organizes itself under a careful hand, not all at once, but line by line, until the whole thing suddenly reads as a picture. The first thing to settle was the open space at the center, the long plaza that would divide the sacred quarter from the quarter where people simply lived. An empire that measured its power in sightlines to the mountains was never going to crowd its holiest buildings shoulder to shoulder with grain stores, so the planners split the ridge the way you might split a house between the rooms for guests and the rooms for family, one side given over to temples and processional courts, the other given over to workshops, kitchens, and the close practical architecture of daily life. Between them ran the plaza itself, kept clear on purpose because a clear space is also a kind of instrument. It lets a person standing at one end look straight across to a doorway, a niche, or a distant summit and see them align. That alignment was not decoration. If you had woken in one of the finer chambers on a particular morning of the year and looked out through a trapezoidal doorway toward the eastern ridge, you would have caught the sun rising exactly where the builders intended it to rise, framed as neatly as if the doorway had been built around that single sunrise and no other. The city's finest structures were set out along lines drawn to the peaks the Inca held sacred, and to the points on the horizon where the sun kept its yearly appointments. You do not need to hold on to the details of which peak lined up with which stone to feel the intention behind it. It is enough to know that nothing in the sacred quarter sat where it sat by accident. The building the chroniclers and later visitors would come to call the Temple of the Sun rose near the highest point of that sacred ground, and it remains, even now, one of the few structures on the ridge built with a curved wall, following the natural curve of the granite outcrop beneath it rather than fighting it square. The masons who raised it fitted stones along that curve with the same discipline you would expect from a wall running straight, each block dressed so precisely against its neighbors that a blade could not be worked into the seam. Inside, a stone platform waited to catch the light of the solstice sun through a carefully placed window, and below the temple a chamber was cut, that some now call a tomb, though no one can say with certainty who, if anyone, was meant to rest there. Even the architecture keeps a few of its secrets close. A short walk above that temple, along a shaped outcrop of the mountain's own bedrock, the builders left a single stone rising like a low pillar from a sculpted granite base, its faces cut and angled with a precision that still draws surveyors up the path with their instruments. Later visitors would name it the Intihuatana, the stone meant, in the stories that grew up around it, to hitch the sun in place. Whatever its exact purpose in the ceremonies of its own time, its geometry was no accident. Its edges were shaped to track the sun's shadow through the turning year, another instrument disguised as a piece of the mountain. Nothing in this part of the city was built simply to stand there and be admired. It was built to be watched, and to be used for watching something else. But if a wall like that took a mason weeks of careful work to close a single seam, what happened to the wall around the corner, the one holding up nothing more sacred than a family's cooking fire and a place to sleep? Did it receive the same care? Or did the builders know even then that not every stone in a city needs to be a masterpiece? The answer sat in plain sight the moment you crossed from the sacred quarter into the residential terraces below it, and the master stonemason who had walked this ridge since the first foundations were cut would have told you, if such men left us their words directly, that the difference was never an accident of time or shortage. It was a decision, made as deliberately as any decision about where to place a temple. In the household sector, the walls were built of fieldstone, roughly shaped, bedded in a clay mortar that filled the gaps between one irregular block and the next. These walls held up perfectly well. Families cooked in them, slept in them, stored their maize and their tools in them for as long as the city was lived in, and they needed no seam fine enough to turn away a blade, because no one was ever going to press a blade to them to prove a point. Function set the standard, and the standard for a kitchen wall was simply this: stand and keep standing through the seasons and the small tremors that passed under the ridge every so often, without anyone below troubling to look up. The finest work, the kind that still draws a hand across a seam almost without permission, was saved for the buildings that were meant to speak to something larger than the people using them. The temples, the ceremonial fountains, the walls that framed the doorways aligned to the sun. There, the same master mason who had once knelt over the andesite quarry with a river cobble in his palm now oversaw men shaping granite blocks with corners so true that the stones seemed to have chosen each other. He had spent years by the time these walls went up, learning exactly how much give a joint could carry and still call itself a joint, and he brought that patience only to the buildings that were judged worthy of it. It was, in its own way, an early kind of engineering economy, the same instinct that a builder today applies when deciding which beam needs a certified weld and which needs only a sound bolt. Spend the difficulty where the building's purpose demands it, and spend ordinary labor everywhere else. The Inca understood that lesson without ever writing it into a code, and the ridge still shows the proof of it, one wall speaking in whispers and the next wall simply doing its job. If your eyes have already grown heavy, let this next part settle over you gently rather than asking anything of you. It is only the shape of a finished city coming into view, nothing you need to carry forward, because that is what the ridge had become by the time these last walls went up. A finished thing, or nearly so, its temples catching the early light before the terraces below them had even come out of shadow, its residential blocks settled into their own quieter rhythm downhill, its plaza still kept open between them, empty on purpose, exactly as it had been drawn out in someone's mind before the first stone was ever cut. From the peaks around it, from the trail that climbed toward the sun gate, or from the ridge across the valley where a traveler might have paused to catch their breath, the city no longer looked like a project in progress. It looked whole. Roofs of thatch, long since gone now but very much present then, would have caught the wind over the temple walls and the household walls alike, one roof line running into the next in a pattern that made sense from above in a way it never quite did from inside any single room. And yet a city this carefully placed on a ridge this exposed could not simply stand and hope. The ground beneath it had already shown, during the years of building, that it liked to shift, however gently, and the granite walls now rising above the terraces would eventually have to answer that shifting on their own terms in the open air without a foreman or a master mason standing by to catch them. That test was still to come, and it would arrive not as a single dramatic afternoon, but as a long, patient rehearsal repeated for centuries, the ground moving and the city, stone by fitted stone, deciding how it would move with it. You could see, if you looked closely enough at the finest walls, that the builders had already been asking themselves this question long before any tremor arrived to demand an answer. Each block leaned back into the wall behind it, rather than standing straight up on its base, a slight inward tilt, no steeper than a few fingers' width over the height of a man, so that the whole face of the wall inclined gently toward the hill it was set against. It was such a small adjustment that a visitor walking past might never notice it at all, and yet that lean was doing quiet work every single day, pressing each stone's weight down and back into its neighbor rather than letting it stand alone. The corners, too, were rounded rather than sharp, softened just enough that a shock traveling through the granite would have somewhere to go besides straight into a fracture. None of this had been left to chance, and none of it had yet been asked to prove itself. The wall had been built to lean and to round its corners and to fit its stones without mortar, but a wall built for an earthquake still has to wait for one, sometimes for centuries, before anyone can say whether the builders understood what they were doing. You are standing in this part of the story, somewhere that does not sit still. The mountains around you are young in the way that matters to an engineer, still rising, still grinding against each other far beneath your feet, and the whole spine of the Andes has spent its long life shrugging off the weight of the ocean plate sliding beneath the continent to the west. That grinding does not announce itself in any way you could feel on an ordinary afternoon. It gathers instead in the rock, the way a held breath gathers in a chest, and then at some interval that no one standing there could have predicted, it lets go. The historical record of this letting go, once the Spanish began keeping one, reads like a slow catalogue of ruin. Cities built lower down the valleys in the Spanish style, with walls of mortared stone and adobe stacked in straight, rigid courses, came down again and again over the centuries that followed the conquest. Cuzco itself, the old Inca capital, was struck hard enough more than once that the colonial cathedral and the grand houses the Spanish had raised on top of Inca foundations cracked, slumped, and in places collapsed outright, while the Inca stonework beneath them, the walls the colonists had simply built upon rather than replaced, stood through the same shaking with barely a stone out of place. You can still see that division today if you walk those streets, the lower courses ancient and unmoved, the upper courses patched and repatched by masons who never quite matched what lay beneath them. Other towns fared worse. Whole settlements in the southern highlands were leveled in a single night more than once in the colonial centuries, their bell towers thrown down, their walls opened like books, while a few kilometers away, wherever an older Inca terrace or gateway still stood, it seemed almost untouched by whatever had just passed through the ground. It would be easy, lying here in the dark with your eyes already closing, to imagine that this was luck, that the Inca simply happened to build in places the earthquakes missed. But the geology does not support that comfort. The fault lines that produce this shaking run under the whole region without much regard for which stones sit on top of them, and the instruments that modern seismologists have since placed across the Andes show tremors passing directly beneath sites like this one at regular unhurried intervals across recorded history, page after page of small shocks and the occasional large one, entered into logs the builders themselves never kept and never could have read. Whatever kept the walls of this city standing while towns built in the newer style came apart was not geography. It was something in the way the stone itself had been asked to sit. So it is worth asking, gently, what actually happens inside a wall like this one when the ground beneath it moves, because the answer turns out to be less about strength than about permission. A mortared wall is, in a sense, a single rigid object. Every stone is glued to its neighbor, and the whole structure is meant to move together or not at all. When an earthquake sends a wave of motion through the ground, that rigidity becomes the wall's undoing, because the wave does not travel evenly through a large, stiff mass. One part of the wall is pulled one way while another part, a moment later, is pulled another. And the mortar, which has no give in it at all, simply cracks along whatever line the strain finds first. Once that crack opens, the wall has lost the thing that made it a wall, and the rest is only a matter of how many more shocks it takes before the pieces come apart entirely. This is, in plain terms, what happened over and over to the colonial buildings lower in the valley, and it is worth remembering as you picture the stones stacked above you here, because it is precisely the opposite of what this wall was built to do. Here, each block sits in its socket without any adhesive holding it in place, resting only on the precision of its own cut faces against the faces of its neighbors, and that absence of glue turns out to be the whole of the secret. When the ground shakes, a dry-fitted wall does not try to move as one piece. Each stone is free, within the small tolerance of its joint, to shift a little on its own, to rise slightly, to rock, to settle back down again once the wave has passed. Engineers who have since modeled this behavior describe it, almost affectionately, as the wall dancing rather than resisting, and the image is not far off. You can imagine, if you like, a shelf of books that have been packed in tightly enough that they support each other without needing a bracket at either end. Shake that shelf gently and the books will shuffle and knock against one another and then stand exactly where they started, because their own mutual pressure and the friction between their covers does the work that a nail would otherwise have had to do. Shake a single book glued to the shelf and it either holds rigid until something behind it snaps, or it does not hold at all. That shuffling is precisely what the incline in the walls and the rounding at the corners had been built to allow. A stone that jumps a little in its socket during a strong tremor needs somewhere soft to land, and the gentle lean the wall carries toward the hill behind it means that gravity is already pulling every stone back toward its resting position even before the shaking has finished. A corner that is rounded rather than sharp gives the same shock a place to bleed off its energy gradually, through a curve, rather than concentrating it at a single hard edge where a crack would otherwise want to start. None of this required the builders to calculate a frequency or a wavelength in the way a modern structural engineer would, with instruments and equations that would not exist for another 4 centuries. It required them to have watched, over many earthquakes and many failed and successful walls before this one, what kind of stone, cut in what kind of way, tended to still be standing afterward, and to have built that observation patiently into the ordinary practice of the trade. The master mason who had walked the ridge with Pachacuti's surveyors, choosing which outcrop of granite would give up the cleanest stone, almost certainly never used the word earthquake in the way you or I might use it in a conversation about engineering. But you can be fairly sure he had felt the ground move beneath him more than once in his working life and had seen, somewhere in his own memory, which walls came through it and which did not, and had carried that memory into every joint he approved and every stone he sent back to be recut, because its face was not yet true enough to trust. This was not a single insight arrived at in one clever afternoon. It was inherited knowledge, tested against failure over generations of builders whose names have not survived, refined the way a recipe is refined, by people noticing which version worked and repeating it long before anyone wrote down why. And that is really the heart of what makes this the city's quietest and perhaps its greatest achievement. There was no single dramatic afternoon when the walls were tested and the crowd held its breath and the stones proved themselves in front of witnesses who then recorded the event for history. The test came instead, the way most real tests of engineering come, in the ordinary unglamorous passage of centuries, one small tremor at a time, most of them too minor for anyone standing here to have even noticed. A few of them large enough to have rattled roof thatch and startled animals, and none of them recorded by the people who lived through them, because the Inca left no written language behind at all, no engineering treatise, no builder's manual, no proud inscription carved into a lintel explaining how the walls had been made to survive. Whatever they understood about stone and motion and the patient art of letting a wall move a little so that it would not need to break, they never wrote down because they had no script in which to write it. It survived instead in the only place it could, in the stones themselves, sitting exactly as they were left, waiting for a modern engineer with a laser level and a seismograph to come along centuries later and ask, with real respect, how anyone had managed this without a single equation. You do not need to carry any of that arithmetic with you now, and there is nothing in this part of the story that asks to be remembered before morning. What matters, drifting here in the dark, is only the shape of the idea, a city built to move a little so that it would never have to fall, tested silently again and again by a mountain range that never stopped shifting beneath it, and never failing the test badly enough for anyone to have needed to write the failure down. The walls held, season after season, tremor after tremor, while the empire that built them rose to its fullest reach and then, not very long afterward, began to change in ways the mountain itself had nothing to do with. It is to that living city, full and busy and briefly at the center of everything, that the story turns next. You come into that city the way anyone would have come into it then, on foot, breathing hard from the climb, and the first thing you notice is not the stonework at all, but the quiet. Even full of people, even at the height of its use, Machu Picchu would have been a hushed place, ringed by peaks that swallowed sound the way the sea swallows sound, so that a voice carried only a little way before the wind and the drop took it. Historians and archaeologists who have spent careers piecing this site back together now believe it held at any one time something in the range of a few hundred residents, perhaps as many as 700 or 800 during the seasons when the court was in residence, swelling higher still when workers and pilgrims came up for festivals or for planting and harvest. That is not a great city by the standards of the valleys below. It was never meant to be one. It was a retreat, an estate, a religious seat built for a ruler and the people who served him, and every stone you have followed this far tonight was set with that single private purpose in mind. If your eyes are already closing, Let them. Nothing here needs to be held on to, only felt, the way you would feel the hush of a place like this if you were standing in it yourself, tired from the climb, glad to be still. The ruler most closely tied to that purpose is Pachacuti, the same Inca sovereign whose ambition set this whole project in motion back when the site was still an idea and a ridge and nothing else. The documentary and archaeological consensus, built up over decades of careful, often disputed work, holds that Machu Picchu was raised as a royal estate for Pachacuti and his family line, a private mountain retreat combined with a sacred center used by his household and by the priests and attendants who kept its rituals running, and likely maintained by descendants and successive Inca rulers for some generations after his death. It was not a capital. It was not a garrison in any serious sense, though it surely could have sheltered and fed people in hard times. It was closer to a self-contained world, tucked into a fold of the Andes where a chosen few could live close to the mountain gods the Inca revered, work fields that fed themselves, and look out every morning over a view that no army and no tribute collector was ever likely to interrupt. What did the days themselves look like inside those walls? That is a harder question, and it is one the ground itself has had to answer, because no chronicle from the time sat down to describe an ordinary afternoon at Machu Picchu the way a diarist might describe a morning market in Cusco. What you have instead is what the excavators found when they finally cleared the terraces and the courtyards centuries later. Grinding stones worn smooth in exactly the pattern a hand makes, turning maize against rock, storage vessels for chicha and grain, obsidian and bronze tools kept and resharpened rather than discarded, bone needles, spindle whorls for spinning wool, small bronze mirrors, the debris of textile work and food preparation scattered in the same rooms where formal, finely cut stonework suggests someone of rank once slept or received visitors. You can picture it if you let yourself, the way you might picture any household going about its business, water carried up from the fountains in the mornings, the smell of maize cooking somewhere in a lower courtyard, someone crouched at a loom in the light from a trapezoidal window, an offering laid quietly at a carved outcrop before first light. One recurring figure in this story, the woman who carried water along the terraces during the years of building, would have known these courtyards as well as anyone, and it is easy to imagine her, older now, still making that same walk between fountain and kitchen long after the last mason had set his final stone and the Mittercrews had gone home to their own villages in the valley below. The remains recovered from the site's burial grounds tell part of the story too, though carefully and with real caution, because early excavators drew conclusions from those remains that later, more rigorous study has had to correct. For years it was assumed, based on early 20th century analysis of skeletal remains, that Machu Picchu had been populated mostly by women, supposedly chosen attendants of a sun cult. Later, more thorough re-examination using modern methods found the population buried there to be roughly balanced between men and women, of varied ages, consistent with a working retreat rather than a cloistered religious house of one sex alone. It is a small but telling correction, the kind that reminds you how much of what people believed about this place for most of the last century has had to be quietly revised once better tools and more careful eyes were brought to the same old bones. And that habit of the record correcting itself patiently without drama is worth carrying with you as the story moves toward its next, much larger reversal, the one that would end the empire that built this place while somehow, almost by accident, leaving this one mountaintop city completely untouched. Because for the estate, the young mason, the terrace farmers, and the woman with her water jars called home, that period of quiet, ordinary use did not last very long before the wider world it depended on began to come apart at a pace nobody on this ridge could have foreseen. So what actually happened out there beyond the mountains, while life inside these walls went on as if nothing had changed? The answer arrives from the coast, and it arrives fast by the standards of an empire that had taken generations to build. In the early 1530s, a small Spanish expedition under Francisco Pizarro landed on the northern edge of the Inca realm, at a moment when the empire was already weakened by a civil war between rival claimants to the throne and by a wave of European disease that had swept ahead of the Spanish themselves, killing an Inca ruler and much of his court before a single conquistador had set foot near Cusco. What followed was rapid and, from every account that survives, brutal in the way conquests of this kind tend to be. The capital seized, the imperial house dismantled piece by piece, resistance driven into the more remote reaches of the Andes over the following decades. Cities in the valleys, temples, palaces, storehouses, all of the great visible machinery of Inca rule in the lowlands and around Cusco itself were found, looted, and in many cases stripped of their gold and silver before being repurposed or left to ruin under colonial administration. Machu Picchu was never among them. No Spanish chronicle from the conquest era mentions it by name. No colonial tax record lists it among the estates seized from the Inca nobility, as many other royal properties were seized and recorded in exhaustive, grinding administrative detail. The most likely explanation, and it is one archaeologists and historians hold with real confidence rather than mere guesswork, is not that the site was secretly defended or magically hidden, but simply that it was small, remote, and by the time the Spanish were consolidating their hold on the region, probably already emptying out on its own, its role as a royal retreat fading along with the royal house it had served. A place built for a ruler's household has very little purpose once that household and the empire behind it have both collapsed. There was no reason for the Spanish to march up a ridge above a river gorge in search of an estate that had, by all appearances, quietly stopped mattering to anyone who might have told them it was there. You do not need to picture this part vividly if you would rather let it drift past. It is enough to know that a great violence swept across an empire, and that this one high, private place happened to lie just outside its reach. So the city did not fall the way lowland cities fell, in fire and confiscation and a Spanish garrison moving into rooms built for someone else. It fell the much slower way, the way almost anything falls when the people who kept it going simply stop coming back. The terraces, which had needed constant attention to keep their drainage channels clear and their retaining walls sound, began to slump and silt without hands to tend them. The thatch roofs that had once covered the finer stone chambers rotted and dropped away within a generation or two of neglect, since organic roofing never survives long without maintenance in a climate this wet. Seeds carried on the wind found soil in every crack the terraces still held, and the cloud forest that had always pressed close against this ridge, kept back for a period of only a few generations by the Mitta laborers' relentless clearing, began quietly to take the ground back. It did not happen quickly, not in the way a fire or a flood happens, but it happened completely. Roots found their way between the fitted stones over the decades, not strong enough yet to topple the walls the masons had shaped so carefully to resist exactly this kind of slow pressure, but strong enough to blur every straight line beneath moss and leaf litter. Local farming families in the valleys below likely knew something stood up there across the following centuries, the way people in a region often keep half-forgotten knowledge of an old ruin nobody has business visiting, but no wider record, no map, no colonial survey ever fixed the city's location for the world beyond those valleys. It simply receded year after year behind vines and fog and the ordinary indifference of a landscape that had no further use for what humans had built on it. There is something almost restful in that if you let yourself sit with it for a moment before sleep takes you the rest of the way. A city that had been raised stone by impossible stone, planned and terraced and quietly perfected against earthquakes and rain, simply allowed to rest too, unbothered, unlooted, unrecorded, while 4 centuries passed overhead and the cloud forest grew thick enough to hide an entire vanished world from view. That long, undisturbed silence is where the story now settles for a while, high on its hidden ridge above the river, waiting for the particular kind of attention that would eventually come looking for it. High above the river, the silence that had settled over the ridge did not break all at once. It simply waited, unbothered, while the cloud forest kept doing what cloud forests do, folding moss over stone and letting roots find their way into joints that had been fitted so tightly no root should have managed it at all. Down in the valley below, though, that silence was never quite complete. Farmers working the lower slopes had long known there was something up there among the trees, walls where walls had no obvious business being, terraces climbing toward a ridge that seemed too steep for anyone to have troubled with. If you can picture that quiet, ordinary knowledge, held by people with no reason to announce it to anyone, you already understand more about this part of the story than most retellings allow. The man. The man was not the first to know it was there, though the story that followed him would often be told as if he were. His name was Hiram Bingham, an American lecturer from Yale who had come to Peru chasing a different ruin entirely, one the Spanish chronicles had called the last refuge of the Inca resistance, and who found himself, by the middle of July, following a muleteer along a trail that clung to the side of the gorge above the Urubamba. You can picture him there if you like, notebook in hand, boots already soaked through, more interested that morning in covering distance than in anything the ridge above him might be holding. The muleteer's name was Melchor Arteaga, a farmer who kept a hut near the river and who, when asked whether he knew of any ruins nearby, answered the way a man answers a question about something he has always known and never thought worth mentioning. "Yes," he said, "up there, among the trees." It is worth pausing on that exchange because it tells you something the later telling of this story tends to smooth away. Arteaga was not leading Bingham toward a secret. He was leading him toward a place his own family already used in the ordinary way people use land for planting and for shelter from the rain. If you have ever lived near something remarkable long enough that it stops feeling remarkable, you already understand how a man could farm within calling distance of walls like these and still describe them, almost as an afterthought, as simply the place up there. That is not a failure of wonder. It is what happens to wonder when it has to share a life with the work of getting food out of a mountainside. The climb itself, by Bingham's own account, was not an easy one, and it is not hard to believe him. The bridge across the river that morning was not a bridge in any sense you would trust your weight to without thinking twice. A few logs lashed together and laid low across the water. And Bingham crossed it, he wrote later, on his hands and knees, more from prudence than from grace. Above the river, the trail climbed through a stand of forest so thick with growth that daylight arrived in patches rather than sheets, and it was hot in the way cloud forest is hot, damp and close, the air doing as much work on your shirt as the climbing did. Somewhere above Arteaga's hut, a boy joined them. The accounts that survive give him only a first name and disagree slightly even on that, so it is safest simply to say what is certain. He was young, he knew the way better than either of the grown men following him, and he seemed entirely unimpressed by where he was taking them. What did the boy expect to find at the top of that climb? Almost certainly nothing that felt to him like news. He had likely been up among those terraces before, the way a child who grows up near a ruin treats it as a place to play rather than a place to marvel at. And that quiet unremarkableness, more than anything Bingham wrote afterward, is probably the truest account we have of how the site actually sat in the minds of the people who lived closest to it. Not lost, not hidden, in the sense the word usually carries. Simply there, folded into a life that had other things to attend to. What Bingham found when the trail finally leveled out has been described so many times since that it is easy to forget how little of it, that first day, would have looked like the postcard image the site would later become. The vegetation had not been cleared. Whole terraces stood buried under root and moss. Walls emerged from the green in fragments rather than in the long, clean lines you might picture now, and much of what would eventually be recognized as a plaza or a temple was, on that first afternoon, simply a suggestion beneath the undergrowth, a straightness where the forest should have been more chaotic. Bingham himself, by his own later admission, did not immediately grasp the scale of what he was standing inside. He noted fine stonework, walls built without mortar, terracing that clearly represented enormous labor, and he moved on rather quickly to other things, in part because the family already living there that day had more pressing matters on their minds than a visiting American with a notebook, because there was a family there. This is the detail that tends to get lost in the retelling, and it deserves to be said plainly. When Bingham reached the ruin, he did not step into an empty city reclaimed entirely by the forest. According to his own account, At least one household, farmers connected to the Richart and Alvarez families of the valley below, were cultivating small plots among the terraces, using the ancient agricultural platforms for precisely the purpose they had been engineered for 4 centuries earlier, though whether they knew that history or simply valued good, well-drained, sun-facing ground is something the record does not settle. Either way, there is a kind of continuity in that image worth sitting with for a moment. Terraces built by hands under a mitre levee, still doing exactly the job those hands intended, still growing food, still holding soil against a slope that would otherwise have long since washed itself into the river. If you let yourself sit inside that scene rather than rushing past it, the strangeness of the moment comes into focus. Here was a lecturer from a university on the other side of the world, catching his breath at the edge of a plaza that had not held a ceremony in centuries, while a few feet away someone was doing the unglamorous daily work of tending crops on stonework so precisely laid that no mortar had ever been needed to hold it together. 2 entirely different relationships to the same ground, existing at the same hour on the same afternoon, neither one especially aware of how strange the other must have looked. What happened next is where the story usually speeds up and where it is worth slowing down instead. Bingham did not, in fact, immediately declare the site the singular discovery history would later credit him with. His initial notes are cautious, more interested in the stonework's quality than in any claim of a lost civilization waiting to be revealed to the world. He photographed what he could through the tangle of growth, noted the layout as best the vegetation allowed him to trace it, and moved on with his expedition, which had, after all, set out looking for something else entirely. It would take further seasons, further funding, and a great deal more clearing before the site would begin to resemble anything like the image that now sits behind so many people's eyes when this place is mentioned. And here is where the historical record forces a small, necessary correction offered gently rather than as any kind of accusation. Bingham was not, in the strictest sense, the discoverer of these ruins, not even among outsiders. Documents and inscriptions found later suggest that at least one other explorer, a man named Agustin Lizarraga, had visited the site some years earlier and left his name scratched into a wall as a kind of signature, the way travelers sometimes do when they want proof of where they have been. Whether Bingham knew of this before his own climb and how much weight to give an inscription against the deeper, generations-long knowledge held by families like Arteaga's is a question the sources do not fully resolve, and it is one worth leaving open rather than settling by fiat. What can be said plainly is this: the mountain was never entirely lost to human memory. It was lost only to the particular kind of memory that gets written down, published, and carried back across an ocean. None of which diminishes what came after, only reframes it. Because whatever the truth of who arrived first, it was Bingham's expedition, backed by Yale and by the National Geographic Society, that would return to the ridge with the resources to do what generations of quiet local knowledge had never been resourced to do: to begin the slow, patient work of stripping the forest back far enough to let the city's actual shape emerge. If you have ever cleared even a small, overgrown garden after a single summer's neglect, you already have some sense of the smaller version of that labor. What faced Bingham's later expeditions was that same task multiplied across an entire mountainside, root by root, vine by vine, with tools not much more sophisticated than a machete and a great deal of patience. There is no need to hold on to any of these names tonight: the muleteer, the boy, the family with their crops, the earlier visitor whose signature outlasted his story. What matters is the shape of the moment itself. A mountain that had never truly forgotten what stood on it, waiting for outsiders to catch up to a knowledge that had never really gone anywhere. And it is that slow work of catching up, the machetes and the vines and the walls emerging inch by inch from centuries of green, that the story now has to climb into next. You would have needed to go slowly that first season, because the mountain gave up its shape only a little at a time. A man swinging a blade through a wall of vine might work for an hour and clear no more than the width of his own shoulders, and what he found on the other side of that hour's work could be anything: a smooth curve of retaining wall, a step, or simply more root and more green, indifferent to how badly he wanted it to be something else. Hiram Bingham's expeditions worked this way for weeks at a stretch, cutting a corridor here, a terrace edge there, following the logic of stone rather than the logic of a map, because there was no map yet worth trusting. If you had climbed up behind them with nothing to do but watch, you would have seen how the city revealed itself not as a single unveiling, but as hundreds of small ones. A doorway appearing between one afternoon and the next, a staircase turning up under a slope that had looked the day before like nothing but hillside. The work of that early clearing was slower and more careful than the popular memory of it usually allows. Machetes came first, but behind the machetes came notebooks, tape measures, a plane table for sighting angles, and the patient business of putting a number to a wall that had, until that morning, existed only as a shape under leaves. Bingham's teams, drawn partly from Yale and partly from local labor, whose names the official record kept far less carefully than it kept his own, spent whole seasons doing nothing more dramatic than walking the terraces with a chain and a compass, sketching the outline of a plaza, marking where one wall ended and a newer one began. It is unglamorous work, surveying, the kind that produces no photograph worth printing in a magazine, and yet it is the work that turns a ruin into a record. The difference between a place people had simply found and a place people could now actually study. Among what they found, and what troubled them the most in a quiet, scholarly way, were the burials. Scattered across the terraces and tucked into shallow caves along the slope were graves, dozens of them eventually, containing bones that Bingham's own physical anthropologist examined on site with the tools of his day and pronounced, with more confidence than the evidence really supported, to belong overwhelmingly to women. It was a conclusion that fit neatly into the theory Bingham already favored, and theories have a way of shaping the eyes that go looking for proof of them. He believed for a time that he had found the last refuge of the Virgins of the Sun, the chosen women of the Inca religious orders, hidden away on this ridge to keep a sacred flame and a sacred order alive after the empire below had fallen to Spanish soldiers. It was a romantic idea, and it traveled well in print, and for decades it was simply what people meant when they said the name of this place. You do not have to hold on to that theory tonight, because history did not hold on to it either. Later, re-examinations of the same skeletal remains, done with methods far more careful than anything available to Bingham's team, found the burials to be close to evenly split between men and women, of varied ages, buried with the kind of everyday grave goods you would expect from a working population, rather than a cloistered religious order. The city, as later generations of archaeologists came to understand it, was not a hidden convent, and almost certainly not the lost capital Bingham first announced it to be, chasing an entirely different, still undiscovered city that existed mostly in his own hopeful reading of colonial chronicles. What the terraces and the graves and the room clusters actually suggest, when you let the evidence lead rather than the story you already want to tell, is something both less dramatic and, in its way, more remarkable. A royal estate built for an Inca ruler and his household, staffed year-round by retainers and specialists who lived there, farmed there, worshipped there, and were eventually buried there when their work on the mountain was done. It is worth sitting with that revision for a moment, not because the correction matters terribly to your falling asleep tonight, but because it says something true about how places like this get understood at all. Slowly, through argument, through people willing to be wrong in public and quieter people willing to prove them so. And that same slow correction, the story revising itself as better eyes were brought to it, is exactly what waited for the objects Bingham carried away from the mountain, which raises a question worth sitting with before the story goes any further. What actually happens to a find like this, once the clearing is done and the crates are packed? The answer in this case took the better part of a century to settle. Bingham's expeditions did not simply survey and photograph, they excavated, and what they excavated, ceramics, bronze tools, silver ornaments, and a great deal of that same skeletal material from the graves, was packed into crates, carried down the mountain by mule train, and shipped north to Yale University under agreements with the Peruvian government that were, depending on whose account you read, either a loan for scientific study with an expected return or a more permanent removal than anyone in Lima had truly intended to authorize. The ambiguity was not an accident of translation so much as an accident of unequal footing, a foreign university with money and laboratories negotiating with a government that badly wanted its heritage studied by the best available science, and that did not, in the moment, have the leverage to insist on the fine print it might have wanted. For most of the 20th century, the objects stayed at Yale, catalogued and studied in cabinets far from the mountain they had come from, while in Peru the sense grew, slowly and then insistently, that something had been taken that ought to have been kept. If you had stood in a university storeroom in Connecticut at almost any point across those decades, you would have found drawers of pottery shards and small bronze implements resting under exactly the kind of careful, climate-controlled quiet that a museum affords its collections. A different kind of quiet from the mountains, but a quiet all the same, and one that a great many Peruvians felt reasonably ought to belong closer to home. The dispute simmered through diplomatic notes, public campaigns, and eventually lawsuits, until an agreement in the early 21st century began the long process of return, crate by crate, back across the distance the mules and steamships had first carried them. It is not a story with villains so much as a story about how differently two institutions can read the same handshake. And it ended in the way these things sometimes do, not with anyone fully satisfied, but with the objects finally home. What never left, of course, was the stone. And it is the stone, more than any crate of pottery, that has kept modern researchers coming back up the mountain generation after generation. Somewhere in these walls, unrecorded and unnamed, worked the kind of master builder this story has already met once before. The man or men whose hands shaped the close-fitting granite blocks of the finest terraces, without leaving behind so much as a signature, let alone a treatise on method. He is gone in every way that leaves a record, and yet he is also, in a very real sense, still here, because every wall he built is itself a kind of document, and modern researchers have spent decades learning to read it. They measure the almost impossible closeness of the joints. They study the slight inward lean and the rounded corners that repeat themselves across separate structures far too consistently to be coincidence. They run their hands, as you might if you ever stood there yourself, along seams so tight that in places you could not slide a blade of grass between one stone and the next. That reading of the stones, patient and unglamorous, in exactly the way Bingham's early surveys were, is what eventually pointed researchers toward a question that has nothing to do with mystery and everything to do with mechanics. Why do these particular walls, built without mortar and without the wheel and without iron tools, still stand upright on a ridge that occasionally shudders beneath them? It is a question that belongs to engineers as much as to archaeologists, and it is the question this story is finally ready to climb into, because the answer, as it turns out, was built into every one of those tight, rounded, unmortared joints from the very beginning, waiting for anyone patient enough to ask it properly. You do not need to understand any of that mechanics to drift off, only to sit for a moment with the shape of the question. Later researchers, walking the same terraces Bingham's crews had cleared, began noticing that the largest stones were not simply stacked but angled, each block leaning a few careful degrees back into the hill behind it, so that the whole face of a wall curved inward as it climbed rather than standing straight up the way a modern brick wall would. Corners rounded rather than sharpened. Joints cut not flat but slightly convex, bulging outward like a knuckle, fitted into a matching hollow in the stone beside it. None of it looked accidental once you started counting how often it repeated, wall after wall, terrace after terrace. The joints cut not flat but slightly convex, bulging outward like a knuckle, fitted into a matching hollow in the stone beside it. You could run a hand along one of those seams today and feel almost nothing, just a faint ridge where two surfaces that should not agree with each other have somehow been made to agree perfectly. It is the kind of thing you notice with your fingers before your eyes catch up to it. And once the people studying these walls began asking why the masons had gone to such trouble, rounding what could have stayed square, curving what could have stayed straight, The answer turned out to have very little to do with beauty and everything to do with a question every engineer eventually has to sit with, whether they are cutting granite by hand or pouring concrete into steel forms. What happens to this thing when the ground beneath it decides to move? You are lying somewhere quiet now, and none of what follows needs holding on to. Let it move past you the way the mist moves past that ridge in its own time without asking anything of you. Somewhere in the middle of the last century, and again more carefully near its end, teams of engineers and seismologists began treating Machu Picchu not as a ruin to be admired, but as a structure to be tested, in the ordinary sense that any building is tested. Does it stand up, and why? Peruvian researchers working alongside colleagues from Japan, a country that has spent its own long history learning to build on trembling ground, built scaled-down models of the Inca walls, block by block, using the same rough proportions and the same dry stacked joints, no mortar anywhere in the assembly. They set those models on shaking tables in laboratories thousands of miles from the ridge itself and put them through motions meant to stand in for an earthquake, watching through slow-motion cameras what the stones actually did when the ground under them stopped agreeing to hold still. What the tables showed, over test after test, was not that the walls resisted the shaking exactly in the way a rigid, modern frame is built to resist it. It was that they danced with it. The individual blocks, cut without mortar and fitted with those slightly rounded, slightly irregular faces, were free to shift against one another by tiny amounts, to rock, to slide a fraction, to settle back, and in doing that small, ungoverned movement, they let the energy of the shaking pass through the wall and dissipate rather than building up in one place until something cracked. A rigid wall meets an earthquake as an argument it has to win outright or lose completely. A wall built the way these were meets it more like a conversation, each stone giving a little, and then finding its way back to where it started once the shaking has passed. The models on the tables, engineers reported afterward, would judder and blur for the length of the simulated quake, and then, when it stopped, settle back into something very close to their original shape, the polygonal jigsaw simply reseating itself under its own weight. None of this, it's worth sitting with for a moment, was ever written down by the people who built it. There is no surviving treatise from Pachacuti's reign explaining resonance or seismic damping, no diagram of how a rounded joint behaves differently under lateral load than a square one. What survives is only the walls themselves, built by masons whose names went unrecorded, generation after generation of men trained to test a fit with their hands and their eyes and to keep working a stone until it felt right, without ever being able to say in words why a particular shape felt more right than another. It is one of the stranger comforts of this kind of history, the sense that a body of knowledge can exist entirely inside the hands of people who never needed to explain it to anyone, and that it can still be sitting there centuries later, waiting for someone with a shaking table and a slow-motion camera to finally ask the question in a language the stones will answer. But a wall that survives a shake is only half the story, because a mountain does not only shake, and Machu Picchu's real enemy, then and now, was never only the tremor itself. So what was it that the builders were guarding against underneath their feet, in the ground they never let you see? The other half of what modern engineers have found lies beneath the surfaces you'd actually walk on if you climbed that ridge today, in a layer of the site almost nobody notices because it was designed from the very start to be invisible. Beneath the terraces, beneath the plazas, beneath the stone floors of what were once houses and temples, the builders laid down courses of loose fill graded by size. Coarser stone at the bottom, finer gravel above it, a skin of soil on top of that, so that rain falling on a mountain that receives a great deal of it every year would have somewhere to go other than pooling against a wall or soaking into a foundation until the ground turned soft. Surveys conducted in recent decades, tracing this drainage layer terrace by terrace, found channels and outlets running the length of the site, quietly carrying water away from every structure that mattered and out toward the slopes where it could do no harm. It is not a dramatic system to look at. Most of it you would never see at all, walking those paths in daylight with your eyes on the peaks above you rather than the ground beneath your feet. But the engineers studying it have said plainly that this hidden plumbing may matter as much to the site's survival as anything visible in the walls, because an earthquake that a stone joint can absorb becomes a very different problem if the ground it's sitting on has already turned to mud. That combination, masonry that moves without breaking, and a mountain drained so carefully it rarely gets the chance to soften, is most of the answer to why a city built 5.5 centuries ago on an active fault system is still standing while far younger buildings elsewhere have not survived a single strong shake. It was never one clever trick. It was two ordinary-sounding decisions, repeated with total consistency across every terrace and every wall by workers who had no way of proving they were right beyond watching what lasted and what didn't, season after season, and building the next wall the same way, which raises the question of what happens now when the pressures on that same ground are no longer only rain and tremor, but several thousand pairs of feet a day. You'd notice it first if you climbed there now, in the ropes. Soft nylon lines strung along certain terraces, low wooden barriers at the edge of paths that once had none, small numbered signs asking visitors to keep to a single route rather than wandering the grass at will. None of it is dramatic, and most of it is easy to miss if you're looking up at the peaks rather than down at your own feet, but it represents one of the largest sustained conservation efforts anywhere in South America. Peruvian archaeologists and engineers, working under the country's cultural heritage authorities, have spent decades monitoring exactly the two things the old builders solved for EIE. The drainage layers, checked and occasionally cleared where centuries of soil movement have shifted them, and the terrace walls themselves, watched for the particular kind of slow bulging that signals a wall beginning to lean under new pressure it wasn't built to carry. Tourism, however carefully managed, adds weight and wear that the original engineering was never asked to account for, and the answer has mostly been patience rather than intervention. Caps on daily visitor numbers, timed entry, rest periods for the most fragile terraces, rotating some sections out of use entirely for a season so the ground beneath them can settle again undisturbed. There is something quietly moving in that arrangement, if you let yourself sit with it. The unnamed mason who once tested a stone's fit with his palms, one of the thousands whose labor built this place and whose name no chronicle preserved, is separated from the conservation engineer now walking the same terrace with a laser level and a notebook by a gap of more than 500 years, and yet the two of them are, in every practical sense, doing the same job. Both are asking the mountain the same question, will this hold? And both are answering it the only way it can be answered, by watching closely and adjusting carefully rather than assuming. Pachacuti, whose wish for a retreat above the world set the whole undertaking in motion, never lived to see it tested by time in the way it has been tested since. Hiram Bingham, whose crews first cut the vines back from these same walls, saw only the surface of what he'd found and never guessed at the drainage system running beneath his boots. It has taken the better part of a century of careful, unglamorous study. Botanists, hydrologists, structural engineers, stonemasons trained in the old techniques and brought back to repair what erosion loosens, to finally read what the original builders wrote into the stone without ever writing a word. What is left in the end is a kind of long relay passed hand to hand across 5 centuries by people who never met and never will, joined only by the same ridge and the same granite and the same patient, unglamorous work of making sure that what stands today still stands tomorrow. That is most of what a great structure ever really is, if you strip away the wonder of it. Not a monument to one man's ambition, though ambition usually lit the first spark, but a very long conversation between the people who build and the ground that has to agree to hold them up. The mountain never really stopped shaking, and it never will. The stones never really stopped listening. That's where I'll leave this one tonight. If your eyes went somewhere around the terraces or the drainage or even a little before that, that's exactly as it should be. None of this was ever meant to be held onto, only to carry you somewhere quieter than where you started. Thank you for spending this stretch of the night with me. If you'd like more of these long, slow walks through the things people built and the ground that let them, you know where to find them, whenever you're ready for another. Sleep well.